Welcome to this Fox News Latino panel on the hot issue of American politics today, immigration. We have three guests with us: Liz Lorente, Fox News Latino, senior political reporter; Alan Combs of Fox News Radio and Fox News Channel; and Dan Stein of the federal immigration reform group, FAIR. Gentlemen, lady, thank you for joining us. Liz, let me begin with you. Who won in the Supreme Court ruling on immigration reform, the Arizona Bill 1070?
Well, it was mixed, and so the victory was mixed.
Well, I saw that Mitt Romney said he viewed it sort of negatively, thought states should have more leeway to decide how to deal with the immigration issue. Governor Jan Brewer of Arizona said she thought it was a win for her state.
Right, right. She said she thought that it was a win and that it was a validation of the argument that states need to take the matter into their own hands because of the failure of the federal government to control immigration. And then at the same time, the White House said it was a victory because the Supreme Court struck down 3 of the 4 provisions they were considering, but that nevertheless it said that it wasn't happy about the provision that was left standing.
Well, in fact, what the court said absolutely was the federal government has control of immigration law. They control it, and the states should not get involved. All that was left standing was this one provision that said if a police officer stops you for any reason, for a legitimate reason, he or she can then ask you about your immigration status.
Right.
Now, the court said it has to be done constitutionally in terms of civil rights laws. You can't just do this arbitrarily. You can't racially profile. But what we've seen from Latino groups and from the ACLU is a promise to go back to court on this very issue. Is that evidence that Latinos view this as a defeat, Liz?
Well, obviously, Latinos who are against it, because there are some Latinos who support it. But it's viewed as a defeat because many think that it's going to result in profiling, because the provision also says if there's reasonable suspicion that someone is here illegally. Now, how do they suspect that? Well, some law enforcement officials say if I ask you for a license and you don't have one and you don't have any kind of ID, that would lead me to suspect that maybe you're not here legally. But they're not always going to be in a situation where they stop you and
well,
you have
I think people
this
fear
documentation.
also it could be skin color, it could be your accent, could be your attitude. I don't know. That's the question. So Dan Stein, when it comes to this specific provision, do you think that, in fact, the courts later will overturn it?
Naturally, Juan, we support the provision. We were involved in helping conceptualize the idea. And I think ultimately if Arizona, as I do believe the state can, if Arizona implements it in a responsible, neutral, and even-handed professional manner, there should be no problem. Now, do I think that's going to stop the ACLU with its insatiable desire to annihilate our interior immigration controls, going to stop them from litigating and throwing up all these frivolous claims to try to get injunctions and wear the state down into settling eventually? No, I think they're going to continue to try to do that, but nevertheless, left to their own professional devices, we believe strongly in the professionalism of local police all across the country and their ability to handle responsibly a requirement, if you will, that when someone after a Terry stop or a lawful stop, there's reasonable suspicion that they may be in the country illegally, simply can make an inquiry to Immigration Customs Enforcement and get a status check.
What's
the bigger
a Terry
question
stop?
is, what's that?
You said a Terry stop?
Well, a Terry stop is when you stop somebody for a reasonable suspicion that a crime may have been committed or there may be some irregularity.
But let me ask you, let me put you on the spot here, Dan, and say what the court ruled against was, it said states cannot arrest somebody or stop somebody without a warrant on simply because of suspicion that they're an illegal immigrant. A state cannot pass a law that says it's illegal for an immigrant to work in the country. So the court did have some rulings that were not in keeping with SB 1070. How do you view those?
Keep in mind, Juan, that SB 1070 actually has about 15 different provisions. About 8 or 9 of them are still good law. There's a provision in there that prevents any state official in Arizona from declaring the city a sanctuary. There are other cooperative and document reform penalties that sustain. There's an impoundment clause for vehicles. There are a variety of other provisions of SB. There's a standing clause for citizens to sue to get the remaining provisions of SB 1070 enforced. So, in fact, much of SB 1070 is still good law and has not been enjoined. Now, the three other provisions that the Supreme Court did enjoin, let's face it, there's language in the Supreme Court decision that is deeply, deeply troubling, in that it not only appears to say states cannot cooperatively participate with the executive branch if the executive branch doesn't want them to participate, but more importantly, the Supreme Court seems to embrace this idea that the executive branch has so much discretion that they can just ignore congressional mandates to actually apprehend and deport illegal immigrants without limit.
So, Dan, it sounds like the Supreme Court decision did not make you happy. Let me come to Alan Combs. Alan, did this decision please you, viewing it from the left?
Yes, it did, because let's face it, 3 out of the 4 elements decided by the Supreme Court were decided against Arizona. And for Jan Brewer, I don't know what she's sipping if she's going to say this was a victory for the state of Arizona. It's cost them millions of dollars to fight this in the court. She lost 3 out of the 4 elements. The 4th element, which you indicated earlier, is still up for consideration in the future should somebody withstanding bring the case. And the notion that we live in a country where you can just be stopped for reasonable suspicion, which is really up to the subjective view of the authorities, show me your papers. Right. The fact that this could happen in the United States of America is something that I hope gets struck down by the Supreme Court when somebody of standing does bring it before the court.
So, Dan, what do you say to that?
Well, I think it's just completely ridiculous. Look, I represent American citizens all across the country who simply would like to see the immigration laws of the United States enforced the way Congress and the American people have asked them to be. And is it too much to expect in our federal system for it to have a complementary structure whereby states, consistently with the federal statutory scheme, carry out or assist the federal government in enforcing these laws?
First of all, this notion that because the feds aren't doing their job, something has to be done. The feds are doing their job. In fact, under Barack Obama, and in fact George W. Bush before him, by the way, in fiscal year 2011, 400,000 illegal aliens illegal immigrants were deported. That's a record. This has happened year after year, beginning with the second half of the George W. Bush term. So that to say that the feds are not doing their job is just not true. Arizona is making this up because it wants to claim sovereignty. The Constitution, something conservatives claim to behold and love and revere, says this is a federal responsibility to enforce immigration law, which is what the court affirmed this week.
Let me just go back to Dan real quickly.
Well, look, I'm not here trying to carry the water. I'm not trying to be ideological on one side of the spectrum or the other. We have a federal system. And ultimately, with 10, 11, 12 million people here illegally and more coming in every day, the argument that because we have a larger illegal immigrant population and therefore because the Bush administration stepped up secure communities and the 287G cooperative agreements, more aliens were in the deportation process when Barack Obama took the oath. Well, naturally, like the pig and the python, more aliens got deported during that 18,
Bush gets credit because
Obama
did it. I get it.
All right.
But the point, no, it's a point. I mean, it's not about who's to blame.
I think
the immigration laws.
I think we've reached the point of diminishing returns on this. Liz, one of the interesting things about this is that if you ask people who are Hispanic about the law, according to a Pew Research Center poll, 75% say they can't stand this. They think SB 1070 is discriminatory. It will lead to racial profiling. They feel it's intended to push people of Hispanic origin out of the United States, 75%. But if you ask the general public, my goodness, 58% approve. A clear majority approve of this law, Liz. What do these numbers tell you?
Well, I think it tells us that many Hispanics know someone, if it hasn't affected them, personally, to discrimination because of seeing them as foreign or not being, of this country, hasn't affected them personally. They certainly know someone. They've worked with someone. There's someone in their family. Many families are of mixed status. And so they see this as, many of them see this as a license, basically, to treat someone who may be here legally, may even be a U.S. citizen, as someone who's possibly undocumented, because it has happened.
So you think in the Latino community, it's family, it's co-workers, and people don't want the law, even though the general public approves of it?
I think there are, even among people who may, to some degree, support a law and support strict immigration enforcement, I think even among those Latinos, there is some concern that it'll be applied by some police officers overzealously.
Now, Alan, when the president took this action on the DREAM Act, Republicans immediately said he went around the law. They played a tape that showed him saying, you know what, the Constitution doesn't allow me to do this. They cut off a part in which he said I might have some administrative remedies or steps I could take.
That part was not played. The fact
but the idea is that people perceive him as having done something in a high-handed fashion and for purely political reasons.
The people that perceive that are people who don't like him to begin with. And yes, even if he did it for political reasons, which he probably did in the middle of an election year, doesn't make it the wrong thing to do. We would not be having this conversation. There would not be a national dialogue right now about immigration, just like there is about health care, did we not have a bold effort on the part of the president. So we're actually talking about this because it's important and because the president put it front and center.
Dan Stein.
Well, we elected a president, not a king. We didn't elect a dictator who could run around Congress and ignore the Constitution. That's why when Congress now rejected twice the DREAM Act, they were saying it's not good public policy the way it's crafted. The president, look, you were talking about tone. Let's face it, this works on both sides of the equation. The minute Governor Brewer signed SB 1070, organizations were running around claiming that this was targeted at, quote, Latinos, as opposed to the immigration issue and immigration status. The polling demonstrates that most U.S. Latinos who are likely to vote are interested in platforms that are going to provide economic opportunity, quality education, and a fair shake for people to get out there trying to make a living and make their way. They're not worried about the DREAM Act or border security issues or
but Dan,
whatever.
Dan, the numbers are pretty overwhelming here in terms of Latino support for the DREAM Act, in terms of Latino support for immigration reform.
But when you talk about coded language and tone, I have heard nothing from the opposition to SB 1070 but a stoking of this idea that there's this wing of the immigration restrictionists that's motivated by anti-Latino animus. And it's an effort, cynically, in our view, to try to galvanize the Latino population, voting population, to an allegiance to one party over the other based on cynical political manipulation. And anybody who's watched Barack Obama's playing around with the DREAM Act since he took office, all the way to this last brinksmanship here right before the election, has to be pretty cynical about the way he's been using the issue.
Alan said even if it's politics, Alan's happy because he thinks it was the right thing, the humane thing to do.
He's saying it's the wrong thing to do. The ends don't justify the means, and it's illegal.
Are you saying it's okay to take someone who's been here since the age of 3 or 4 or 5, who's lived almost his or her entire life in the United States, who's lived a crime-free life, who was brought here by his or her parents, who did not come of one's own volition, who then perhaps even served in the military or went to college, we should be putting our resources toward deporting that person? All the president's saying is we're going to prioritize. We have a certain amount of resources. Here's how we're going to allocate them. Fiscally responsible, something conservatives like. Are you going to deport that person who came here through no fault of his or her own because they are called illegal? Is that what we should be doing?
I don't know where you're headed with this, but I'm interested.
I'm talking about what the president did.
I'd like to see. I think I want a president who will enforce the law. The reason immigrants want to come here, Alan, is because America works. It's a place where
you're
people
giving
don't
me a
get
bunch of
special
platitudes.
treatment.
I'm saying specifically, here's what the president did. Here's what he carved out in terms of our priorities. He said he had the administrative right to make certain choices. Here's where we're putting our resources. Would you deport someone who's been here for 12 years, who knows only the United States, who's going to school, and to no fault of their own is in this country? Would you deport that person?
Alan, I'm a 35-year immigration attorney who knows the law. The only authority that the executive has is for an immigration judge to consider a claim for extraordinary relief on a case-by-case basis.
And I'm just asking, in that case, would you deport that person? That's all I'm asking. Would you deport that? In that case, would you deport that person?
You're asking me a hypothetical about an extraordinary relief claim.
Yes, because that's who this pertains to. That's what the president did.
He stopped all immigration law enforcement, and DHS is prepared to issue a directive saying unless you've committed a felony, they have instructed their officers not to detain aliens unless they have committed a felony.
It is a matter of allocation of resources. To say that he hasn't done his job, or the feds are not doing their job, or the president is not enforcing the law, is just not accurate.
All right,
Janet Napolitano has never come to Congress.
Liz here a second. Liz, let's then go to the purely political argument that Dan raises. Is the president likely to win the Latino vote? I don't think there's any question here. The answer is yes. Right now, the polls show 60, in some cases 70% in the Latino community. And we've seen a boost after the decision on implementing administratively aspects of the DREAM Act. So the question becomes, is the Latino base actually going to turn out, or, as Dan was suggesting, maybe, think, well, the economy is really the critical issue. We're not that excited about it. And we see, in fact, people returning home to Mexico and elsewhere in increasing numbers because of the slowdown in the U.S. economy. So what do you see in terms of an energized voting base in the Latino community? Is it there or is it not there?
Well, I think now it's more energized, but I think people are going to wait to see. There was some skepticism along with relief. And people were saying, well, he has said this before. There was an announcement last year that there was going to be prosecutorial discretion and that they were going to go after the worst of the worst. And even after they said that, DREAM Act students were still getting rounded up. My email was exploding with story after story about DREAM Act students who were getting arrested and slated for deportation even after this announcement. And so there is that, oh, we've heard that before. There is that mindset. Let's see if it really happens this time. So I don't think that they're ready to, the people who wanted to see this happen are quite ready to vote. Certainly they're more inclined. They're more willing to believe. They're hoping that he really means it this time. But the fact is that many Hispanics and immigration advocates of other ethnic backgrounds have been feel let down by both parties. They do. They feel that it's been a political football.
And that nothing's gotten done. We just have political paralysis around the immigration reform issue.
And that nothing's gotten done.
So you think they're going to punish both sides, and you think, in fact, despite all the action on the DREAM Act from the Obama administration, they may not get a higher turnout from the Latino community.
It depends on what is done between now and election.
What could the president do between now and then?
If we keep, well, actually, do what he says he's going to do, which he hasn't really done.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
Well, if people stop hearing stories which dominate headlines all around the country every day about people who are not criminals,
being deported,
people who, like the ones Alan described, who came here through no fault of their own, who are graduating at the top of their class, and who in every other sense would be an ideal citizen, still being aggressively pursued. There's one girl in New Jersey who was put in jail. She was this person. She fit the bill, but she was put in jail for 9 months. For part of that time, she was held with prostitutes and murderers, convicted. And so even after the announcement, if these stories continue to steal the thunder away from this announcement, then it's not going to be the luck that the Obama administration is hoping that it's going to be with the Latino vote.
Dan, do you agree?
Well, obviously, I think this is a cynical manipulation by the president to try to galvanize what he thinks is this is machine politics. He's trying to replicate the Harry Reid, Sharon Engel model, the rope-a-dope strategy on the DREAM Act before the election. The president doesn't have the power to do what he says he's doing. I think that may be subject to legal challenge. Certainly there'll be congressional challenges to it, because in the end, the president's painted himself into a corner. What he's doing is actually destroying the possibility of any bipartisan compromise on true reforms in immigration policy by doing all this unilateral activity. And there's no basis for moving forward legislatively unless this administration is prepared to actually commit to programs that will prevent a recurrence of future illegal immigration in exchange for something like a modified DREAM Act concept.
Well, I must say, I remember when the Bush administration tried to get something done on immigration reform, and again, it was blocked. Yeah. So, I mean, that was on a bipartisan
it got blocked,
basis.
But it got blocked for 2 reasons. The left, wasn't prepared to make any concessions on family chain migration.
Most of the no votes were Republican.
Yeah, but Menendez was pushing hard against the consensus in the Senate, and Obama. They both objected to limiting family chain migration. And then on the business side, on the conservative side, none of us were convinced that the reforms were actually going to prevent future illegal immigration.
Alan, let me end up here with you. Alan, do you see the Latino community activated, or do you see them now after all this action in this last few weeks?
I don't speak, as you know, for the Latino community, but it seems to me that if you look at the poll numbers, the president has done something that seems to be so far helping him politically with the Latino community, and On the other side, Mitt Romney, in spite of being asked numerous times, has refused to commit one way or the other. Does he agree or disagree with what the president's done? He won't give a yes or no answer.
He won't
Take
say
a stand on something. Where do you stand? Let us know.
Alan Combs, Dan Stein, Liz Lorente, thank you for joining us for this Fox News Latino debate on immigration. We appreciate it.